families continue to face inequities with crucial systems of support. Diverse perspectives and experiences in leadership are crucial for education advocates who hold power and make decisions on behalf of Black and Brown families. Today, we'll chat with some of those advocates, prominent and rising leaders in decision-making roles, to discuss how we can address these statewide inequities, provide families with true and meaningful access to opportunities and justice. Today is Thursday, August 12th, and this is Sepas. Welcome. We are joined today by two phenomenal guests, two Arizonans who are part of these efforts. We'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, starting with first Jeff Zetino, who is all in education, research, and data. I forgot your title, Jeff. We'll let you research and data person. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Danny. Jeff Zetino, I'm Director of Policy and Research with All in Education. Quick introduction to myself is that I'm a son to an undocumented mom and an undocumented dad that came over from Mexico City and El Salvador, respectively. They came to LA and found each other, fell in love, and had a family. Luckily, I was born here in the United States, but I saw my sisters grow up in Mexico and make the transition here, and also experience the challenges of being undocumented in the States. So I consider myself, an immigrant because that's the life that I lived with my parents and my sisters. First generation to go to college, trained as a social worker, and I made the move to Arizona 17 years ago. Been here for 17 years. Trained as a social worker, cut my teeth as a community organizer, spent a little bit of time in institutional change, and now working with All in Ed, and super excited to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Next, we have Marla Franco. Dr. Franco is the Assistant Vice Provost of Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives at the University of Arizona. Dr. Franco, it's such an honor to have you today.
Yes, no, thank you, Danny. First and foremost, I just want to thank All in Education for hosting this really important conversation. Certainly honored to be accompanied by Jeff for today's panel. And so my name is Marla Franco, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Provost for Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives at the University of Arizona. I've worked in public higher education for 21 years now across 2 different states, actually starting off in California, which is where I'm originally from, and then moving here to Arizona approximately 8 years ago. I identify as a Latina. I'm also a first-generation college graduate myself, ×3. Super excited and certainly honored, and carry it as a responsibility to the community, particularly in meeting and advocating for the educational needs of Arizonans as someone who holds a doctorate degree. I also am very much one who has a lot of skin in the game, not only because of my profession, but I'm also a mother of 2 school-age children, a 10th grader and a 7th grader. So the advocacy is not just taking place within the workplace, within the University of Arizona, but it also takes place within my home and school districts, both local to me and of course across the state. I also very much pay homage to ancestors who have come before me, who have paved the way in various ways that they could to really allow me to be where I am today. So I am the great granddaughter of farm workers from the Central Valley of California, really starting from humble beginnings and having great appreciation for land, people, and place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franco. That introduction brought back so many of my identity, my own identity, and there's so much even that we just 3 of us share. Being the son of farm workers as well, there's so much pride that I carry today with just that statement that I never carried before. Do you mind, Dr. Franco, do you mind starting out talking a little bit about some of your upbringing and maybe how some of those values shape your interest in the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's quite a bit of innovation, vision, and trailblazing efforts that I have the opportunity to lead. I think connecting to my first generation college graduate status, you break a lot of barriers along the way within the educational system, along with society's expectations of you. And I've had to do that throughout my educational journey as a student myself along the way and as a professional. So I guess I have a lot of personal experience in breaking those barriers, and I apply that and use it really at the forefront of guiding my efforts at the University of Arizona. We became a Hispanic serving institution in 2018. And it's interesting because it's a federal designation that comes to us from the US Department of Education for institutions of higher education that enroll at least 25% Hispanic Latinx undergraduate student enrollment. What really that means though is that the guidance provided to us is just based on an enrollment metric, right? And we know in all-in education, like access is important, but it's also not enough, right? And so I get to think creatively, innovatively, both with and for this community about the innovation and the influence that we have to lead within educational spaces and our community spaces to create the types of environments that are going to allow us to thrive. And so those are the things that I get to think about, troubleshoot, problem solve with partners across the state of Arizona and across the nation in doing this work. There are actually 569 Hispanic serving institutions in the nation. And in Arizona alone, there are 22. It's quite interesting though, because HSIs across the nation account for about 18% of all US higher education institutions, yet we enroll 2/3 of all Latinx undergraduate students in the nation. So when you're thinking about partnerships and spaces within higher education to really be partnering to move the needle, collaboration with HSIs is really, should be at the forefront of our strategy, our resource allocations, and much of our efforts, particularly as we kind of build out some hopes and dreams, right, in terms of relief and recovery efforts for the nation.
And so Jeff, kind of similarly, related to that access component, what have you learned kind of just high level generally about the state in terms of access to higher education opportunities in your work?
Yeah, so like access to higher education opportunities, well, we understand and we know and we see in the data that it's a very small percentage of Latino students that are actually making it to college, and even a smaller percentage of those students that actually finish college. Unfortunately, we see about 15% of Latino students being able to make it to college and about half of them being able to graduate. We published a report last year called MAPA, which really started going into the data and into the trends and trying to unpack and decouple the academic achievement data from not just how are we doing as a state, but how are different ethnic groups doing within our state. And what we saw was a huge shift in demographics. So Arizona is becoming much more Latino, much more faster than any other ethnic group. And this has ramifications for our state and for our state's economy. So without a well-prepared and well-educated Latino base, our tax base is going to be, decreased, and it's not going to afford our state to afford services and essential services. So we see the change in demographics, and then we also see the lagging behind in academic performance within our Latino student body in every area, whether it's access to early childhood development or early childhood quality care settings, third grade reading levels, 8th grade math, high school dropout, high school graduation, and college attainment. And another thing that we tried to do within the report is we tried to look and understand the historical context and historical policymaking that really make Arizona unhospitable to the Latino community, going back from SB 1070, anti-immigrant efforts, et cetera, and how that plays into creating this bifurcated education system within Arizona, where when we think about the Arizona education system, we think that, we lag behind the national average, right? But what we see is that white students outperform the national average, and Latino students underperform the national average and even underperform within as compared to Arizona standards. So we see that education isn't bad in Arizona, but it's bad for Latino students. So we really try to kind of understand that. And another thing that we highlighted within the report was the coupling of Latino students in impoverished neighborhoods being shuffled into lower ranked elementary, junior high, and high schools. So we really try to take a holistic look at academic access or access and academic achievement.
Yeah, if we can take a step back just really quick, Jeff, what was your motivation? Like where are you from and why did you want to finish college?
Yeah, so I just think back to like my mom and my dad making that journey from Central and South America, right? Like situations have to be pretty dire to be able to have to uproot your family and go to a country that's completely foreign and alien to you. So I saw a lot of that, a lot of those values of my mother and her ganas and her working and her always, staying up late to help us with education, and my dad's love for learning. And he was an electrician in El Salvador, and he came over here and he had to start as a TV repairman, and he worked his way up, built his own company and succeeded in that way. So just seeing that, but more importantly, just seeing the differences within communities, right? I remember when I was in junior high, me and my friends, we decided to ditch. Actually, it wasn't junior high, it was junior year of high school. We ditched one day in the morning, we all got together and we said, hey, let's go to the beach. We're in LA, Santa Monica's not too far away. It's one bus and it takes you straight to the beach. So, instead of going to her school, which by the way, looks like a prison itself, we ended up going to the bus stop, jumped on the bus and started heading out towards the beach. And what really dawned on me and what really impacted me a lot was our brown neighborhood, 99% Latino Hispanic, changed from a Latino neighborhood to an African-American neighborhood within a couple of stops, to a middle-class neighborhood within a couple other stops, to a really high-class neighborhood that was predominantly white right next to the beach, where on one side of the city you have a working class, people in the bus trying to hurry up and get to work. And on the other side of that, bus route, it's people trying to go enjoy their lives and be on the beach. And the first thought in my head was, well, how do I get out of my neighborhood? But the second thought right after that is like, why does my neighborhood look this way? And right after that is like, what can I do to change that neighborhood to make sure that everybody within this neighborhood has equal access to opportunity? I just remember thinking about all the littered talent and dreams that were within my neighborhood that never got the chance to really fulfill their own dreams and their own life course. So that's why we do the work that we do, or I do the work that I do.
For sure. Thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Franco, same question. But where do your motivations come from? You're a college graduate times 3, like you said. Where did that drive continue to come from each time?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question, and certainly appreciate hearing a little bit more about your story, Jeff. But I think for me, I always say both to myself and to many of our students who attend the University of Arizona, is that we really are our ancestral hopes and dreams. Like we are what they prayed and cried for, right? Many nights, right? While they toiled various sets of circumstances and navigated kind of inequitable conditions, right? So Danny was nice enough to share some of the questions with us in advance. And so this might seem a little like show and tell, but I really felt like it was a good way to possibly respond to that question. So I'm gonna show you 2 things. And so my grandmother was very near and dear to my heart. It's one of the most prized relationships that I will ever probably have in my life. And there's 2 things I want to show you. She actually passed away just a couple months ago. So this is actually, this little card here is a tri-community adult school located in Southern California. And it's dated September 7th, 1967. and it's got my grandmother's name on it. And there's a check box indicated on this little card, and it says no high school diploma. So this was the reason she was attending adult school. Her journey along her life included becoming a mother at quite an early age. And so it required an alternative path towards continuing education, even at the high school level. So fast forward many decades, many arduous nights, this is how it ended. And this is her college degree, right? You know, when I think about all that she gave to me and all that she taught me, this is my inheritance. Her tenacity to go after what she wanted, what she thought she deserved, and to really engage in both formal learning and lifelong learning was the greatest lesson, the greatest achievement I could ever see a woman of color lead in my life. And it really is that educational journey that I was witness to in my grandmother serve really at the forefront for what I champion and why I champion this work with such fierceness. I often will tell people, you know, if I seem antsy and impatient and persistent about this, it's because I am, right? I have known that educational access and equity around an educational system that is responsive to their own needs has been a long time coming. And it's something that our community certainly deserves and needs access to. I mean, you certainly heard Jeff talk a little bit earlier about the systemic inequities, the systemic things, right, that have really kind of created what we are experiencing today, and certainly what generations before this have experienced. And so, you know, it's important as well as we, you know, problem solve and as we partner and synergize across the state, that we're not, you know, simply thinking about solution finding at the peripheries, but what are the structural inequities that exist, right? So that we can really get to the root systemic causes of educational inequities. And so, you know, those two pieces are really the types of things that fuel me on a daily. There is not one day that goes by that I don't think about her. And the best way that I can fulfill her legacy is by doing this work passionately and vehemently for our communities.
That is such a beautiful story. I couldn't help but get emotional. I lost my grandmother about a week ago.
I'm sorry.
And so it's what a beautiful tribute to your grandmother. Beautiful tribute to just think of those things. Thank you so much for sharing that. I apologize. Still, it's a beautiful story. I would have got emotional regardless because that's just who I am. But it is a beautiful story.
Exactly. Yeah. The fact that I wasn't crying, so I probably would have cried right there with you.
Well, thank you though. So talking a little more though about some of those earlier experiences. This is a question for either one of you. Your identity, especially as a Latino, what messages were you hearing from your own communities about what it means to be Latino and what it means to get an education afterwards? This is for either one of you.
Well, we weren't really hearing much about education. You know, education was always this value and this virtue that our parents always wanted for us, right? So, you know, both my parents came in here as immigrants, and almost in a naive innocence handed us over to this education system, right? Like, aquí están mis hijos, edúcanlos, teach them, educate them. But they never understood that they were active partners within that education, and they could ask more from that education system. So, you know, we went from elementary school to junior high to high school, where I never understood the importance of, you know, being tracked into the right track to get access to the right courses, AP courses or advanced courses. It was just kind of like what Dr. Franco was talking about, this system that you entered and you exited kind of automatically, right? I lucked out and I kind of made friends with some other students that were part of a higher track that I was. And just by being their friend and asking to be in the classes that they were, I got placed in geometry and algebra and AP bio and, you know, chemistry and physics. And just because of that happenstance, I was able to go into college, but it was fortuitous, but it wasn't the expectation nor the norm. Like I said, when we left that high school to go ditch, it was covered in fences with a bunch of security guards that looked like a prison, and it wasn't a place of learning. So unfortunately, the community that I came out of didn't really emphasize or prioritize that educational environment. And if it wasn't for those friends or for that fortuitous, you know, set of circumstances, was I able to get a college education. And that's why I think I'm so passionate about looking behind or looking forward or looking to where my family's still at and seeing what we can do to improve those communities. And Dr. Franco, like I really wanted to highlight what you said about having that passion and that ganas and that lived experience to really advocate in a way that nobody else can for the circumstances that you were part of. So I just really want to uplift your leadership and pay homage to it.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think that, the conversation today, is so important. I mean, I draw upon constantly, my own experiences, many of my own experiences, similar to as Jeff described, that really inform not just what I do, but also how I do it. And, for me, I mean, I guess the messaging that I heard, I would say that, kind of internal within our family. So it may not necessarily, of course, have been my parents' journey to have pursued higher education themselves and complete degrees, but they always valued education. And they supported us in the things that we needed to do at home in order to be engaged in our education, right? So supporting us in doing our homework and coming to school events and supporting us, in school sports or activities, right? But, I think that, so while messaging kind of internally, there was certainly messaging around the value for higher education. I would have to say that sometimes, externally, people who came from where I came from, I mean, as we were waiting to go live and Jeff and I were, talking a little bit about the neighborhoods that we came from, the cities that we came from in Southern California. And so in my neighborhoods, people, it wasn't common to go to college, right? That was not the pathway of most people in my neighborhood. But I think generally there was still a value for higher education, but not many people who had taken that path themselves, nor could they really exactly provide you the type of guidance maybe that we were seeking to get there. I think that I found that within, circles of friends and within some people within my school system. But I do have, I think, this one very vivid memory where that was not the case. The type of messaging that I got was quite off-putting. And I always give a little bit of gratitude to a little bit of a stubbornness streak I have in not always listening to what people tell me. But I have a vivid memory of being in high school and meeting with my guidance counselor. And it was perhaps maybe my junior year where it's kind of like key times to be talking about college. And she asked me, where I had planned on applying to college. And I had a dream school. I had aspirations for myself, like regardless of what messaging was occurring around me. And I told her what where my dream school was. And she came back in the conversation and she came back and basically kind of said, well, you might want to have some backups to that. And what I heard from that messaging were messages like, well, maybe you're not good enough to get into your top choice. you should probably think of have some alternatives as plan Bs and plan Cs, because maybe you're not going to make it. And so, you know, while she shared that with me, I continued to be persistent and insistent on still applying to that school. I did take her advice and I did apply at a few more schools and applied to those. But guess what? I got into my dream school and I went there and I graduated. And so that experience is so vivid to me. And I share it often, you know, when I'm in front of educators or students or families or communities, right? Because even though I got a message kind of directed at me that ran counter to what I foresaw for my future, you know, thanks to kind of that persistent, stubborn streak, like I still kept that as my North Star, as my goal, as my aspiration, right? And so it's important to be steadfast in what we foresee for ourselves, and be just kind of tenaciously passionate and thoughtful and intentional about pursuing those goals for ourselves. I mean, thankfully, you know, I think folks like ourselves are trying to create this greater structural support network across the state, right? So that fewer of our students have to encounter situations like that. We want them to be in environments where they are getting positive messaging, where there are structural steps that are helping facilitate attainment of those goals for themselves, access to higher education, degree attainment, you know, thriving within the workforce in our state. So that's just a little bit more about kind of my experiences and ways that I've navigated them.
Thank you, Dr. Franco, because I really identify with that story, right? Like I heard some of those same messages and they were almost traumatic in nature because I still see them and they still kind of rile me up. I remember my first day of ninth grade in high school, you know, the principal brought us all into like this huge auditorium, right? Because our high school had about a freshman class of 1,000 students. You know, wow. 500 of which ended up graduating high school, but 1,000 students cramped up into this auditorium. And the principal tells us to look at the person to your side and one of you isn't going to make it. Mm-hmm. And it just it just punched me in the gut. And I was like, yeah, who in the heck are you to tell me or anyone here what we are or what we aren't going to do? Flash forward 4 years later, and he was absolutely right. Only 500 of us graduated. So, wow. So I still get upset at that message that I heard, yeah. But it was the right message because it actually ended up happening. So was he right in saying that? I don't think that he was right in saying that. I would have loved to hear a more positive message, but right. Systemically, like that's what we're setting up our kids to survive, right? Survive this high school, and one out of the two of you isn't going to make it. Now, one out of the two of you might make it and graduate high school, but then how many are going to go on to college and so on and so forth? So systemically, like the expectations that we have for our students, they're so low, but at the same time, we have to open our eyes and say that those are the actual expectations of our community, right? And what are we doing as a community to reinvest in our educational system and really turn those numbers around? Because if 15% of the students make it to college, that means 85% of those students or of that community never made it to college and hopefully graduated high school, but that perpetual cycle of poverty is still there within those communities. Yeah, unfortunately. Absolutely.
And I just wanted to add that same message. It was not until I had this position working for this organization that I even heard that others had a similar experience. I thought it was just me. And Dr. Franco, my story is almost identical to yours. The guidance counselor telling me to have backups to apply to my dream school. What's different is that I listened completely. I didn't apply to my dream school. And how many of us have had an experience like that and don't have the network or the parent support, or the community support to uplift us and to give us that extra push that we might need? And it wasn't until this work that I realized so many of us have had those experiences where we feel very much alone. And that's not necessarily the case because these are circumstances and systemic issues that are happening to the community. It's community-wide. And so I think of all the things that I wish were different for myself. And that being the next question that I have for you both, what would you like to be different in this state for regarding Latinx education attainment? What changes would you make? And is that influenced by your current lens or by a previous lens?
Yeah. So I mean, I think what I would certainly first and foremost, like to see is really a strong, intentional investment in public education in the state of Arizona. One that is designed to be accessible, equitable, and inclusive. And one that is reflective of who the population is in the state of Arizona. That is one thing that I think, would absolutely move the needle, or at least create the momentum to move the needle. Oftentimes some of our ideating and innovating, with partners across the state are just so strapped and tied based on some of the realities regarding how things are resourced or inadequately resourced, right? And then, similar to what Jeff explained a little bit earlier or alluded to, just even some of the legislative pieces and the policy pieces that have created this accumulation of structural barriers over time that have made it like near impossible, right, for us to give ourselves as a state the opportunity to access high quality, inclusive, and equitable education. Jeff even alluded, I always appreciate when people bring to the story, the implications that it has for being able to be a thriving state within our nation, right? It has, so whether or not perhaps you have school-age children within your home or college-age, adults within your home, this still has an impact on you, right? This still has implications for how you live and who you live with and what you can and cannot access within the state. And so I think that unless we start thinking, collectively and about systemic solution finding, right, and really resource education appropriately. I mean, I think it's always one of those things that I advocate. One of the strategies that I advocate for is double down on what works. Sometimes when we do have access to some resources, we might kind of be thinking about kind of the shiny, glittery new tool that we might think is the silver bullet, but it's not, it's really not, right? And there's a lot of work happening, a lot of amazing work happening in pockets throughout our state, where maybe the efforts and the resources are really kind of cobbled together to make it work. But if we only kind of double down on what we know works and what the evidence points to in terms of effective practices, that would also move the needle. So I'd love to see more of that. I mean, it's something that always kind of guides some of the strategy that I lead both at the University of Arizona, but in partnership with other higher education institutions, nonprofit organizations, community organizers, legislators, and so forth. So.
Jeff, same question. What changes would you like to see? Were those influenced by your current lens or by a lens that was from your upbringing?
Yeah, definitely. What changes that I would like to see? Well, I guess one of the things that kind of riled me up is that we haven't seen change, right? In the last 20 years. Back in 2000, the ASU Morrison Policy Institute published 5 shoes waiting to drop in Arizona's economy. And one of the shoes was the not preparing minority communities, especially Hispanic communities, educationally, so that they're able to provide this tax base or increase the per capita wealth within our state, because they were seeing this population shift. So ASU community advocates up and down the line, everybody was sounding the alarm 20 years ago. And we haven't seen a dent in that academic achievement gap for the past 20 years. So what we have been doing isn't working. And what we've seen is that our state has the outlook that it's good enough, right? If one of the arguments that I've heard is that we get a lot of return on investment for the little that we invest in teacher pay or in resourcing education, because hey, look at our academic outcomes are okay. But why are we settling for okay, and why are we trying to lowball teachers and schools and school systems when we know that if we invest in early childhood development or in education, we get a $14 to $1 return. So that's $14 for every $1 that we invest in education. But what resonated with me, what Dr. Franco was saying, was this holistic approach, right? From the grassroots to system leaders. One of the most inspirational moments in my life was around 2010, and being able to glimpse the community organizing that was happening around SB 1070. Briefly before SB 1070, the community was coming together to fight for immigration reform, because immigration reform was really important to the Latino community. But then that immigration reform conversation turned into an SB 1070 conversation, where we saw, federal agents rounding up people, putting handcuffs on women, and arresting our community members. That instilled a sense of fear in Arizona. But the reaction to that sense of fear, the community organizing that happened in that moment, the walkouts, the students getting involved in politics, this reawakening of the Latino movement and the Latino power that we have in the state, has really shifted our state 10 years later to one of the most important states in our nation, because we're purple and we have, a real probability of turning blue. It took 10 years of hard work to change those dynamics, and I think it's going to take another 10 years of hard work holistically to change these academic outcomes that we see within the Latino student experience. But what is it going to take? I think it's going to take that community organizing, everybody coming together and really fighting for policy change. But one thing that we saw that is becoming now kind of like an evolution of that thought is that it's not enough to just organize community. We need to step up and lead. So we need to be in those positions of power, in those tables, around those conversations, making those decision-making tables, and bringing our lived experience into the fray, right? Like Dr. Franco was saying, that sometimes she has to be apologetic because of the passion and urgency that she brings into an issue, but there's no apologizing for the lived experience and the things that we have seen within our own lives, right? And we need that type of urgency and that type of passion to make the changes that we haven't seen in these past 20 years. So what I would love to see is more people like Dr. Franco in seats of power, making decisions on behalf of the children in our community.
That does it's a good segue to kind of this next part of the conversation. But I do want to ask more about power, what it means to be a community that has power and how education plays into that. Jeff, do you mind talking a little bit about some of the research you do, kind of where we're seeing most power and perhaps people who have been elected to serve the communities, Latino communities especially?
Yeah, most definitely. So the germinating seed of All in Ed came about in 2018, where our board chair, Luis Avila, was working with the ACLU on disproportionate disciplinary practices within our state, right? So they were investigating why children of color were being removed from the classroom setting at a higher rate than any other student within our state. So they started advocating on this Demand to Learn campaign, where they were saying that we need to take a look at how we discipline our children within the school setting. But that campaign had a huge roadblock when they reported their findings to the state school board. And what they saw was that the state school board had 3 Latinos and 27 board members made up of white board members. So within 3 statewide bodies, the State Board of Education, the State Board of Charter School, and this ABOR, Arizona Board of Regents, 30 seats, only 3 occupied by Latinos. So the realization was that even if we bring the most specific ask, the best articulated argument, we're not going to be heard, and people are not going to understand our needs because they don't have the lived experience to make that connection, right? So we need to start populating some of the decision-making seats with Latinos or people with this lived experience. Beside the statewide makeup of these state boards of ed, we also see it at the district level. So only around 15 to 16% of local school board officers are of Latino descent in a state where we see 46% of the student population being Hispanic Latino. And you see that even within administrators and even more so within teachers. So we really need to start understanding power, representation, and how to ask for better policymaking and decision-making within our state.
Dr. Franco, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just, a few thoughts. I absolutely agree with you, Jeff. And I think that, we also have to be quite strategic in that there's the effort around really ensuring greater representation at those tables, right? So greater compositional diversity at those tables. And then I think simultaneously, like that counterpart effort around ensuring that folks are really kind of approaching those tables with an equity mindset, with an equity lens, right? Even for ourselves, I think we have to, take stock sometimes of our own biases in approaching those tables, so that we really are kind of helping to ensure that we're working, with and for the communities that we represent. So I think that compositional diversity within those settings, really, what type of work do we do to ensure that, those at the table currently and those who are yet to come, what work do we have to do to support a greater equity mindset as they engage at board levels, right? One of the things that really is a great opportunity for me within our community is to serve as a board of trustee at San Miguel High School. And that is an experience, they're so kind. They're often, just expressing gratitude towards my service as a board member. But, I always tell them, little do you quite understand how important that role is for me, right? Because when I think about the younger version of myself and who I had or who I didn't have in my life, right, along that journey to give me the type of messaging that I need, right? The fact that I can be a board of trustee in my local community within a local high school and have that level of influence and advocacy, that's a gift. That's a table that I want to be at. That's a table that I want to remain at. And just grateful for those types of experiences that I get to have, and certainly would encourage others to be engaged at that level if they have the opportunity to do so.
For sure. Danny, if I could add one thing. Also in relation to power, right? One thing that we saw within the data is this concentration of Latinos within lower ranked schools in high poverty areas, right? So, but that wasn't isolated to Latinos, right? We have a lot of minority communities and white communities that are living in poverty and that are affected by a lower quality education system that's accessible to them locally. So it's not a black, brown, or white thing. It starts to become kind of like a poverty issue, right? And one thing that we're seeing right now, we're beginning to talk a lot about the social determinants of health, where it's not just access to a doctor or access to medicine, but it's what happens around that health experience, right? The access to good food, access to housing, proper transportation, even policing within your neighborhood has an effect on your health and life expectancy. Robert Wood Johnson came out with a study a couple of years ago that showed that if you're born in South Phoenix, your average life expectancy is, I believe it was 65 years. But if you live in Scottsdale, your average life expectancy is 14 years longer, so 79 years. So within a 20-minute drive, you see a loss of 15 years of life because of that surrounding neighborhood, right? And the negative effects that poverty have on your health. But what we're starting to talk about now is that it's those same social determinants of education that lead to these academic achievement gaps that we're seeing within our communities. And like I said, Black, brown, and white, if you're in an impoverished neighborhood, the likelihood of you getting a good quality education is much lower than if you live in a more affluent neighborhood. And that's one of the things that we're beginning to unpack. And I think that's where we see this joining of forces, whether it's housing advocates or health advocates, education advocates, policing advocates, that can and are coming together to really fight for a new way of resourcing not just education, but communities themselves.
So, Dr. Franco, there's one thing you mentioned a couple times, and I just want to ask both of you, what does it mean to have an equity mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, and particularly within the context of education or higher education, you're both looking at, you're simultaneously looking critically within our systems and structures for things that help facilitate success and impede success. And while you're finding strengthening greater pathways towards educational access, educational attainment, that's inclusive, right? You're looking closely, for example, at the data to be mindful of any inequitable disparities in how students experience the education system, right? The quality of their education system and the outcomes associated with the education. And you're using that information thoughtfully to guide intentionally your strategies, your decision-making around resource allocation, programming, investment, educator training, what have you, right? And you're also, like I said, thinking simultaneously critically, right, about the things that impede success for the outcomes that we want for our communities. What are the things that get in the way? And to think critically, interrogate them, mine the data to really understand what those impediments are, and then strategize in community with others, really to dismantle, right, or re-strategize around those structures so that they're aligned with much more equitable opportunities that ultimately lead to much more equitable outcomes for our students.
Jeff, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah, no, and I was gonna preface it by saying it's a little loaded, and I think there are words that we use so often that sometimes get lost in the mix and lost in translation even. Right. Talk about equity and access, and so just having an equity lens. How do we do that better in the work that we do every day to ensure that communities are getting what they need, and those things, those unique nuances not getting lost in some of that translation. So, I know that it's something we talk about a lot, even within our organization, but if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear.
So having that equity lens to me is really understanding that history impacts our present state. And what I mean by that is that there's history allows the formation of certain institutions within our society that give rise to the results and the outcomes that we see today, right? Whether it's poverty, disproportionate outcomes in health, or disproportionate outcomes in education. So if you take a historical lens to our present situation, and if you add on that equity lens, then you have to admit that we're not fighting for equality, just saying that everybody starts at the same starting line, but we have to understand that some people start ahead or behind, right? So equity then becomes a resource issue about the people that started ahead. Is it ethical and is it morally correct to help someone that started behind? And now that is the crux of the decision and the conversation. Are we willing as a society to invest from those that started in front to those that were left behind? Now that, it hits your check, it hits your pocketbook, it hits your tax structure, it hits everything that it means to say that we're going to reinvest in making sure that everybody has an equitable chance at self-realization.
Both of those answers are really are beautiful in a sense, and there'll be some snippets I think that we take from that to kind of guide the conversation in the future. But our last question before we kind of wrap up: what does in the future look like in terms of the investments we need to make in both of your lines of work? Both of you doing a little bit different things that do align ultimately. Dr. Franco, we'll start with you. What does that investment look like for especially the universities that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just very quickly, earlier when we were talking about kind of, being at the table and influence and advocacy, one of the things that I actually share is that, yeah, there might be 569 Hispanic serving institutions across the nation, but I am only one of two people who are at an AVP level with a specific focus to HSIs within our title in the nation. My other colleague actually has a comparable role at Montclair State University in New Jersey. And the two of us are it in terms of being at the highest levels of leadership relative to our positions at HSIs. And so by way of that, one of the things that I have the opportunity to do is to sit on President Robbins' senior leadership team. And so, the questions that I get to pose, right, the considerations that I offer, the things that I insert into the conversations, right, to ensure that my colleagues at the table are thinking inclusively, are thinking more equitably, right, and really kind of challenging those systems and historical pathways, as Jeff alluded to, right? The other thing, though, that I'm really excited about doing, and this is kind of just part of, my job did not come with a prefabbed manual of how to do this work. And it's actually something that I appreciate. I don't mind having a blank slate in front of me and getting visionary, ideating, and creating. But one of the things that has led me to do is developing and launching something called the AZ HSI Consortium, which launched the end of January. Because one of the things that also is near and dear to, I think, the way that I work is doing this with and for the community that we serve, and doing this in partnership with one another with kind of locked arms. I think we're going to be much more effective in doing this work together. So the AZ HSI Consortium pulls together the 22 HSIs throughout the state of Arizona, really helping us develop as a community of practice, really enabling for the sharing of resources and information, best practices, collectively going after opportunities together instead of battling them on our own, right? And so there's a lot to be said by bringing folks together in a community. And so along with my colleague, Dr. Ray Rivera from Estrella Mountain Community College, he and I are leading those efforts along with everyone in the consortium to really create a sense of community of practice to champion access and opportunity and educational attainment at HSIs in the state of Arizona.
That's wonderful. That's awesome. A little bit shocking to hear those numbers, though, but still, wonderful those efforts that are happening in the state. Jeff, same question. What does that investment look like?
Yeah. So cool what you're doing, Dr. Franco. I think investment in two areas. The first area is we got to invest in Latino leadership. We have so much talent leadership within our communities that we really need to uplift that talent. So we need to develop better pipelines of leadership development, not only into education, but into all of those social determinants of education. Secondly, I would say we really got to take a look at our funding formula of education here in Arizona. It's complicated, it's antiquated, and we're one of the only states that doesn't have a poverty rate part of that school funding formula. So we really need to take a look at that and start investing in the future of our state.
Great. Well, thank you both for that wealth of information today. And we're going to end with two just kind of more lighthearted questions. The first one being, imagine that All in Education is updating the infamous Loteria card, the Loteria card icons, and has asked you to submit a suggestion for consideration. Who or what Latinx cultural icon would you suggest and why? Jeff, we'll start with you.
I was hoping you were going to start with Dr. Franco. No, but I think the nerd in me comes out, and I'm a huge fan of Jorge Luis Borges, author of so many great literary titles. So I think that's one that belongs on that Loteria card.
Thank you. Dr. Franco, what about you?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's not maybe a particular person, but I think following how the card is formatted, I would like to see La Doctora be a part of Loteria. I can't even imagine what it would have been like for me as a young child to play that game and to see that type of imagery on that card. And to know that that's been my pathway and something that I've been able to achieve along with many other Latinas in this nation. Knowing, right, that, you know, that adult high school card, right, that my grandmother carried some time ago, certainly reminds me of the beginnings of an educational journey of an amazing trailblazer as her. So I would love to see that be on the Loteria.
I love that. We just got a comment from somebody on our Zoom call. This la maestra, la activista, la doctora, la presidenta. So I think those
There
are
you
all
go.
wonderful additions to this. And the last question, consider how you're feeling today, like right here, right now. If you could cancel or throw la chancla at one thing, what would it be? It can be anything that is currently frustrating you perhaps right now. And Dr. Franco, we'll start with you.
Yeah, you know, for me, I think it's, I would love to do that towards anti-science sentiments. Because, you know, particularly for our communities, COVID-19 is not over. The pandemic is not over, especially with so many of our children returning to in-person learning. And obviously the challenge that we've seen across our state in terms of providing the safest environment as possible for our young learners. It's challenging, both professionally and personally as a parent of school-age children.
Jeff, what about you? Yeah, well, initially my chancla was aimed at daycare centers and just the expensive nature of quality early childhood settings. One of my friends just spent $22,000 in a year for, you know, like a daycare setting. And, you know, me having a 2.5-year-old, you know, it's ridiculous to look at that. And also a lot of our community doesn't have access to quality early childhood care. Now, with that said, my chancla is now aimed at just the low wage and the low pay that we give early childhood quality, early childhood educators themselves, social workers, home visitors, et cetera, which I might add, they're highly female dominated areas where we have policemen, firemen, and other professions being compensated at a rate that's extraordinarily much higher than those female dominated positions.
That's a whole separate pack of steps, I think. No, but as we end today, I just want to thank you again. It's such an honor to have both of you on. Your wealth of knowledge, so integral to these conversations and just how we approach day to day and hope for what the future holds for our community. So thank you both for being here today. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and who's sent questions, who's sent comments. Thank you for joining us. Hope the rest of the week is wonderful. Until next time, thank you very much. Adios.
Thank you.